Welcome, everyone, to this 77th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development here at the Clements Library. And just in case you're joining us for the first time, we do use the chat. And if you can change the setting to everyone, that keeps the conversation going. And we however, encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section. We also allow you to see the questions that other people are asking, and you can give it a thumbs up to upvote the question to help reorder it. We do have the live machine captions turned on, so you can change those settings to suit your needs. And I can only control so much of what you see. So play around with your screen so that the size of the speaker and the size of the slides works well for you. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I also would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. And today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, friends, click very quickly on the poll if you haven't answered it yet. And I am going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, so it seems like we have a fair number of people, over half of the respondents, say that they can name 1 to 3 suffragists. So that's one of our, and then someone on the program can list more than 10, which is lovely. So let's see, I don't know if I can view the details. Can you see those details, or is it just me? Let's see. So yeah, so lots of the names we would expect for suffragists: Stanton, Wells, Anthony, Lucy Stone, the Grimke's, and yeah, lots of Susan B. Anthony. And I love that somebody said, is it cheating to say Helen Hamilton Gardner?
No, I love it.
Ida B. Wells, Katie Chapman. So yeah, so thank you for participating in that poll, and we appreciate it. I'll stop sharing. Oops. Did I happened here? Slideshow. All right. I would also like to acknowledge that today's episode is sponsored by Cinda Sue Davis. Cinda, we really appreciate your enthusiasm for the Clements and your support and participation. So thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce, in honor of Women's History Month, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin, an award-winning historian, author, and professor specializing in the history of women, gender, and sexuality in the United States. A frequent contributor to the Washington Post and other major media outlets, she also serves as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Since 2007, Hamlin has been a faculty member at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where she is now the Chamberlain Family Professor of History and Chair of the History Department. In 2022, Hamlin was elected to the National Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters, the first historian to hold this position. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really honored to be invited. As you may have overheard at the beginning, I love everything about Michigan, and I love your beautiful library. I was lucky enough to spend a couple days there last year participating in a workshop. So I want to also thank everyone who came to that and thank my friend Paul Erickson for the amazing job he does. And many thanks to Anne for setting up such a wonderful event. And of course, to Cinda Sue Davis for her support. So I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. I'll talk a bit about sort of the process of writing Freethinker and then what emerged to me as the three big themes of Freethinker. And then I'm really excited to hear your questions, objections, thoughts, contributions at the end. I know some of you may have read it, some not. So there will be a couple maybe spoilers in here, but nothing that you wouldn't really get from reading the back of the book. So not too many spoilers. Okay, now I'll share my screen in 1 second. Oh, can everyone see that okay? Okay,
Yes,
great.
that looks
Angela,
great.
if anything happens or it pauses, just let me know. Thank you.
I
All right, awesome. So I first met Helen Hamilton Gardner when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin. Um, and I was writing about how 19th century women used science for feminist purposes. And one of the women that I encountered was Helen Hamilton Gardner. And I encountered her in the pages of Popular Science Monthly, a very popular, as the name suggests, 19th century magazine, where she was writing in to dispute the claims of Dr. William Hammond, who had been Surgeon General for the Union during the Civil War and then the founding president of the American Neurological Association. Hammond developed a really keen interest in the difference between men's and women's brains. And this was the time when women were asking/demanding the right to go to college, and people were looking to Hammond's research to explain why women couldn't go to college. And Hammond said that he had determined women's brains differed from and were inferior to men's brains in 19 distinct ways. And this woman I had never heard of, and that really no one had ever heard of, named Helen Hamilton Gardner, starts disputing Hammond in the pages of Popular Science Monthly. And I thought, oh my gosh, who is this woman who has such nerve to go up against one of the nation's leading doctors and say, actually, your research makes no sense. You already know the sex of the brains you study. Your questions are totally biased, and this is wrong. And so that's what started me on the Helen Hamilton Gardner path. And yes, this is her brain. She took this argument so far as to first encourage her friends in the suffrage movement, especially her bestie, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to donate their brains to science, because one flaw in existing research was men like Hammond would compare the brains of great men of science and literature and statesmanship who had donated their brains to essentially say, hey guys, why don't you figure out why I'm so awesome? They compared those brains to the brains of women who Gardner called hospital pickups, women who had died alone on the streets or in hospitals for unhoused folks. So she said, even if there is a difference, you're not going to get it from these comparing apples and oranges. So anyway, she convinces her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to donate her brain so that science could study the brain of a prominent woman. Stanton says yes. Her children, when she dies in 1902, say, oh my gosh, that is insane. Absolutely not. You could not, we're not donating your brain to heathen Helen's statistics, they called her. So when Gardner died in 1925, she made sure her will was airtight. so that her brain would go from her head directly to Cornell, which had the nation's biggest brain collection, and that is where it remains, floating in formaldehyde outside the psychology department in this display case that you see here. And this was big national news. The New York Times devoted many front page stories to it, including the last one proclaiming woman's brain not inferior to men's. So Gardner would have rested comfortably in the afterlife, knowing that her brain substantiated her lifelong contention. So that is how I met what I call her HHG. That is how I met HHG. And over the years, I just continued to be fascinated by her. And I came to realize that her brain donation was actually like the least interesting thing about her. She had an amazing life that can be sort of summarized as she's a fallen woman, which we'll talk more about in a second, who rather than slink away in shame, the kind of classic 19th century tale in the plot of so many 19th century novels, decides instead to change her name, reinvent herself, and start again. And she dies as the highest ranking woman in federal government and a national symbol of what it meant for women, at least white women, to finally be full citizens. Her suffrage colleagues credited her as the most potent factor in securing congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. So, Freethinker tells the story of this amazing woman and her path and what we can learn about the 19th century women's rights movement that culminates in suffrage through studying her. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my research because researching this book was so fun. I loved every second of it. I met so many amazing people and went so many great places. So I'll share a little bit about that, and then I'll share what I think were the three big themes that emerged to me from this research. So one fun thing I did is I went everywhere Gardner lived. This is me. Well, this is not me. This is the current residence of the home where she lived in Sandusky, Ohio. So the part that convinced me that I needed to write a book about Helen Hamilton Gardner was when she became a fallen woman. This was not something she ever talked about. This was not something publicly known. This was something that came to light through the research I did. So in the 1870s, Gardner's family had given everything they could sacrifice for the Civil War. And so they had no money, and she became a teacher. She's the youngest of five, and that was really the only way for a middle-class white woman to support herself. So she becomes a teacher, and in the early 1870s, she became the youngest school principal in Ohio, and she lived in Sandusky. And this is the house where she boarded with the widow Melville. So this house is important in the story because the other boarders at the widow Melville's house were the brother and sister-in-law of the guy who ran the Sandusky Daily Register, the daily newspaper. So Gardner is in her early 20s, and her name was not Gardner, it was Alice Chenoweth, and she was a very beautiful teacher. So the people of Sandusky start wondering, why is the Ohio Commissioner of Common Schools and a statewide elected officer named Charles Smart, why is Charles Smart constantly in Sandusky? Sandusky's not the biggest city in Ohio. It's not the capital. Why is this guy constantly in our town? Well, comes to light that he's constantly in Sandusky because he's visiting this beautiful young school principal, and they are having an affair. He told young Alice Chenoweth that he was divorced, except for he's totally not divorced. And so this makes its way to papers across the state, thanks to her like direct express connection to the Sandusky Daily Register from her housemates. Some Ohio papers even print her name. As you can see here, they misspelled it, Chenoweth, but the point was made that she is now a fallen woman. She's disgraced. She loses her job. She's run out of town. And like I said, rather than slink away in shame, she starts asking herself and the nation really larger questions like, why? Why am I humiliated and run out of town while Charles Smart, the guy who had said he was divorced, suffers no consequences and continues on unscathed? So this is, I think, the moment that really sets her trajectory, her larger, the next 75 years path of, well, not 55 years, of arguing for women's rights and becoming a national leader in this vein. And what sets her on this path is what we would call today the sexual double standard. And that's what she wants to dismantle. She moves to New York City and lives in this apartment on the second floor in the Upper West Side, and she reinvents herself with a new name that she chooses for herself based, unfortunately, on Charles Smart, which we can talk more about later, but Hamilton and Gardner are his grandmother's maiden names. So she becomes Helen Hamilton Gardner, and she begins living as if Charles Smart were her husband. Again, he's not, but that's how they live the next section of their lives in New York City. She makes her public debut as Helen Hamilton Gardner in 1884 with a series of lectures that were introduced by the great agnostic himself, Robert Ingersoll. And in these lectures, which she later publishes as a book called Men, Women, and Gods, this is the frontispiece from that book, she really goes to the heart of the sexual double standard by investigating what she believes are the Bible's errant statements about women, and where she's asking, where do we get these ideas about women and about sex from? And so she's arguing for free thought from a feminist perspective. And I also want to point out that I love this picture because she's so tiny and the chair is so huge. Um, and she was known for being very petite. She was 5 foot tall-ish, around 100 pounds. And she had such a stage presence and such a persona that emanated from this teeny frame. And she looks so young when she makes this big splash with Ingersoll himself introducing her. She cultivated him as a mentor, and he really helps facilitate her entry into public life in the 1880s. By 1893, at the World's Fair in Chicago, newspapers like the New York Sun reported that she created the profoundest sensation. Helen Hamilton Gardner gave more talks than any other American woman at this marquee 19th century event. Newspapers also reported that the rooms where she spoke were so packed that people were bribing police officers at the door to be let in. They wanted to hear what she had to say. And what she had to say was a mix of free thought messages, women's rights messages, and messages against the sexual double standard. The speech she gave at the Chicago World's Fair was called Women as an Annex, ANNEX, where she was saying, we have been sold a bill of goods that makes us think women are like a sidebar to life and not autonomous individuals in their own right. So that's her early kind of entry into public life. And to tease these things out, as I mentioned, I went every place that she lived, and I tried to go in chronological order. And I started with the Chenoweth family reunion in West Virginia, which was really so fun. And for her, being a Chenoweth, that's her birth name that she had to change after her sex scandal, was so important. The Chenoweths were a first family of Virginia, and she felt a lot of pride in that. And she felt even more pride in the fact that her father had relinquished that first family status in objection to slavery and moved his family to Indiana and fought for the Union. So she has kind of a dual heritage, Union and Confederate, from her Chenoweth story. I also spent a lot of time at the National Archives and at the Library of Congress, is where most of this research was done, looking through boxes like this. This is just a sample of many carts this size of petitions and letters that women wrote in support of the 19th Amendment. Some of the most interesting and useful materials I found were at the National Archives in the Civil War pension records. That's where I learned a lot of nitty-gritty details about Gardner's personal life, because the pension records, people would submit all sorts of random things to prove who they were and what they were going through. And Gardner, the man that she married after Charles Smart died, was a leading Civil War veteran, so he has tons of materials at the National Archives. I also spent time in Greencastle, Indiana, which is where her family moved when she was a girl. That's the picture on the left. And I show that because the 1870s materials were on the top shelf, and they told me that no one is allowed to climb the ladder. And I just want you to rest assured that I did climb the ladder. It took a few calls to my university legal office, but I climbed the ladder and I got the 1870s materials. This is the interior of the house in Sandusky where Gardner was a boarder. And I compare that with the house that she lived in DC, which was the first time she owned a house, and she loved this house. And her DC house is really important, not just to her, but to the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. So I want to have these two pictures because she designed her dining room, as you can see, as like an exact replica of her Sandusky boarding house dining room. And we'll talk more about her DC house in a minute. So that's a little bit of where I went and what I looked for, to paraphrase Thoreau. And now on to what struck me as the big themes of this research. One, sex. I was going to say foreshadowed, but I've done more than foreshadow. I've basically said this was a big point, I think, of the research, that not only Gardner, but thousands of other women like her were motivated to enter first the temperance movement for many, and later the suffrage movement, um, to demand rights because they were so concerned about the sexual double standard and how that impacted their lives. Gardner talked about this often in veiled ways, and in the early 1890s, she turned to fiction. And this was because women couldn't say out loud words like sex, much less how they encountered sex and what it meant in their own lives, because of the Comstock laws that were passed in 1873, in which described all conversations about sex, even the most, basic kind of rudimentary anatomy discussions, as obscene. So Gardner turns to fiction, and she wrote two novels, excuse me, in the early 1890s, where she wanted to highlight for readers what the sexual double standard meant for women, and how so many women like her, although she never came out as one herself, how so many women came to be fallen women. And so I love this quote that was the frontispiece for her first novel, and really her thesis statement. Why is it that men are valued for so many things, least of which their chastity? And why is it that women are really mainly valued for chastity? And so she wants her readers to sympathize through her fiction. For her two books, for her two novels, I should say, she wrote many other books, but for her two novels, she became known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women. And she was really proud of this designation. And this also moved her into further advocacy. And the cause that she advocated for in the 1890s was not the vote. She thought the suffragists were a little too mainstream in the 1890s. Those were not her people. So she was not a suffragist yet, but she joins forces, oddly enough, with the temperance activists, the women of the WCTU. This made for strange bedfellows, because Gardner was neither a C nor a T. But what they had in common was they wanted to work to raise the age of sexual consent for girls. If we were live and in person right now, I would ask you, in 1890, what do you imagine was the legal age at which girls could consent to sex with grown men? And you would guess things, and you would be horrified to learn, and I would see the horrified looks on your faces when I shared that the age was 10 or 12 in 38 states, and in Delaware it was 7. So to women like Gardner, the age of consent really crystallized like everything that was wrong with society. How could this be the case? So the Women's Christian Temperance Union had already begun advocating to raise the age of consent, because they were inspired by a British movement to do the same thing. And the British movement looked relatively easy. The reformers raised awareness, and within a year, the British Parliament raised the age of consent to 16. This was in 1884. Women's Christian Temperance Union leaders saw this and said, oh, well, gosh, we should do this too. So they start going state by state by state, and they think most of the temperance women, the 200,000 plus members of the WCTU, most of them are not suffragists yet. Their president, Frances Willard, is, but most of the rank and file membership thinks the vote is a bridge too far. They believe the lie that your husband votes for you, your father votes for you, your son votes for you. So they go to the state houses and they say, hey, do you guys know that in our state, the age of consent is 10, and that's wrong and we should raise it? And they thought they would just let the guys know and they would raise the age. Well, obviously that is not what happened. They were laughed at, they were mocked, they were ignored. So this age of consent campaign of the 1890s, I argue, is really what turns the 200,000 plus temperance women into suffragists. They see, oh, women actually do need the vote to advocate for themselves. And Gardner's really active in championing this movement, and she does so through a magazine she edits called The Arena. This is a page from The Arena, that's Gardner at the top and Frances Willard to her lower left. And she basically turns The Arena in 1895 into a single issue magazine to champion and report on the age of consent. She publishes blacklists of states where they've got no traction, who's doing a good job, where it's been raised to 14, who's raising it to 16. And to sort of fast forward a bit, what the women learn by the end of the 1890s is that the only states that raise the age of consent to 16 or 18, which is the reformers' goals, are Kansas, Wyoming, and Colorado. Again, if we were in person, if I could see your faces, I would say, what do Kansas, Wyoming, and Colorado have in common in the 1890s? And you would say, or at least the one of you who knows 10 plus suffragists would say, those are the states where women could vote or where they had at least partial suffrage. So this really drives home the point that bodily autonomy and political autonomy are two sides of the same coin. In particular, women see this from the Colorado example, where in 1894, women of Colorado are enfranchised, and they also elect that same year 3 women to the state legislature, including Carrie Clyde Holly. Carrie Clyde Holly has the designation of being the first woman ever in the US to introduce a legislation that becomes law. So what is the first ever piece of legislation introduced by a female legislator? Well, you can already guess, legislation to raise the age of consent. So for years after this passes, the example of Carrie Clyde Holly is championed by suffragists in their newspapers, at their conventions, as prima facie evidence of what happens when women can not only vote, but run for office. Women can change laws to have bodily autonomy. So Gardner, again, this is where she learns politics. This is where she learns how a bill becomes a law. This is where she practices her lobbying, her legislating, her politicking. She learns a lot from this movement, as does the broader field of women's rights activists at this time, including both suffragists and the much larger temperance advocates. And this really came to light for me through a series of letters that Gardner wrote her best friend, Mary Phillips, who she calls here Little Phil. And because you all are an archive, I like to show these archival documents, and I love this one. This one is from the Adelaide Johnson collection at the Library of Congress, which is one of my very favorite collections of all time, because Adelaide Johnson was the sculptor of suffrage, and what she did was invite all the women's rights leaders to her studio and invite them to sit for their busts while she sculpted them. And then she asked them all these really deeply personal and searing questions. And then she wrote it all down after they left, all the really nitty-gritty gossipy things they said. And so because of this connection, somehow she ends up with a bunch of letters that Gardner wrote to her friend Mary Phillips, and maybe entrusted them to Adelaide Johnson, or maybe Adelaide Johnson stole them from Mary Phillips' house, which I think is more what happened. But anyway, in these letters, these coded letters, Gardner writes the truth about her sex scandal. And you can see at the top, so she writes it in code, Little Phil, and she signs it Little One. And at the top, if you crane your head, you can see she writes, best destroy this letter, underline, underline. And what she writes about in this letter is that she had lived for 25 years with Charles Smart as if he were her husband. She told the world he was her husband after their affair when they moved to New York together. And that on his deathbed, she found a letter in his pocket from his daughter. And the daughter indicated that they had been seeing him all along and that he really had never divorced his first wife and been in touch with them all the time. And so when he dies, this creates a real crisis for Gardner, because now she's one of the most prominent women in America. And his actual wife is saying, well, I'm the heir. Not that there was any money to have because he lived off Gardner, but she was going to make a big public scandal about how her husband had been living for 25 years with this other woman. So Gardner is trying to get her friend, Mary Phillips, to shut down this scandal. And Gardner herself hightails it to Puerto Rico, where she begins traveling and living with the guy who becomes her actual husband, Selden Allen Day. So if unlike me and Paul, you haven't spent a lot of time reading 19th century letters, let me just tell you, this is a doozy. Most 19th century letters are not this juicy. Most 19th century letters are like, I went to the market and I visited Aunt Bertha. So this really got my attention, and this is when I knew I had to write a book. So theme number one, sex. Theme number two, race. After Gardner marries the Civil War hero Selden Allen Day, they travel the world for 7 years. Then they decide to relocate to Washington, D.C. They move there and buy a house in 1910. They settle at this beautiful house in Northwest D.C. And Colonel Selden Allen Day was a Union hero, a hero during the Civil War and a career Army officer. So when they moved to D.C. in the 1910s, think about who's in power. It's all Civil War veterans, their sons, and their nephews. And so Day's connections provide Gardner with a really unprecedented level of access, a level of access that the suffragists have never had before. Not only through her husband, but through her proximity, she quickly establishes herself as Nassau's most efficient DC volunteer. And this is because she lives next door to the Speaker of the House, James Beauchamp Champ Clark of Missouri. And I want to highlight this, what next door means. Next door means they have adjoining porches. So Gardner, because she's so charming and smart and savvy, does things like wait inside her door with a tray of piping hot peach muffins. And she waits until she hears click, click. And then she knows Champ Clark is at his door. And then she walks out like on accident and says, "Oh, hey, Champ Clark, do you want some freshly baked peach muffins?" And he says, "Sure." And then she's like, "How is our bill coming along? What do you think about the prospects of us getting a suffrage committee? How can we get our committee out of our bill out of the rules committee?" And she lays into him and gets a lot of work done this way. Excuse me, spring has sprung here in Cincinnati, and I am allergic to everything. That is my problem here. Sorry. I don't know if it's sprung yet in Michigan, but everything is green powder here. So Gardner is next door neighbors with Champ Clark and begins using this power to aid the suffragists. Again, she hadn't previously been a suffragist, but becomes one when she moves to DC and needs a new purpose. And this is where I really begin to see the importance of race, and more to the point, racism, in how the 19th Amendment gets through Congress and ultimately ratified. Gardner's first big suffrage contribution is she's Alice Paul's right-hand woman in the planning of the 1913 suffrage parade, the biggest women's march in history up until the 2017 march. And Gardner works side by side with Alice Paul in planning this parade, and Gardner uses her DC connections to get permission to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. And she's also the one who calls the cavalry in to remove the protesters that blocked the parade for 3 hours. So really, without Gardner, this parade never would have happened in the way that it did. But also, and less positively, but equally, or perhaps even more importantly, this is where the element of race really becomes so obvious in the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. So Black women reached out to Gardner and Alice Paul and said, "We heard about this march. We really want to participate. How do we sign up?" For the most part, Alice Paul ignored these women. You could go in the archives and find at least 3 letters from the leaders of the Howard sorority saying, "We keep writing and you keep not writing us back. How do we participate?" But ultimately, Black women get the message that they're not to march with the white women. And this is not actually what the Nassau main office in New York says, but this is the message that gets conveyed to marchers like Ida B. Wells. And Gardner and Alice Paul defend this racism by saying DC is a southern city, and they're concerned about, they know that who is in Congress in 1912, 1913 are Southern Democrats. So they fear alienating the party in power by having an integrated event. And they write this down, and this is part of the record. And this is where we start seeing how race and racism seep into the trajectory. So Ida B. Wells famously refuses to march at the back of the parade, and she walks in right along with the Illinois delegation where she rightly belongs. But this is a part where Gardner helps set or plays an integral role in setting this agenda. So just as a reminder, in the election of 1912, Democrats, which at this time are mostly Southern Democrats, take control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. So Gardner and the suffragists know that to get the amendment through Congress, they're going to need at least some Southern support. And this weighs on them and plays perhaps an outsized role in a lot of their tactical decisions. I also want to highlight this Alice Paul photo for another second, because this is another big part of the story is the frenemy-ship between Alice Paul and Helen Hamilton Gardner. They start off working together, close friends and allies, but after the parade, they become rivals and they basically hate each other's guts. And what they hate about each other, what they really can't stand, and what splits the entire suffrage movement is the question to protest or not to protest. Alice Paul, as I'm sure you all know, wants to protest. Gardner, while in her heart a radical, does not want to protest. She wants to put her husband's Rolodex to good use, and she wants to work behind the scenes. So she uses this rivalry to insert herself in the highest echelons of power in DC. When she gets back from a trip to California in 1916, she gets wind of the fact that Alice Paul has started protesting, or in her words, heckling President Wilson. She's aghast. So what she does is she sits down and she writes a letter to Wilson's chief of staff, this guy named Joseph Tumulty, and she says, hi, I want to introduce myself. Here's my calling card. Here's everybody I know. And I want you, Joseph Tumulty, to know that not all suffragists are protesters. We, the women of Nassau, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, are not protesters. We are nonpartisan. And to help you learn this, she says, I've written a memo with a who's who, like side by side description of the difference between Alice Paul's National Women's Party and Gardner's Nassau. And I point this out because this proves really influential. A few days later, Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of Nassau, reaches out to Wilson and asks for a meeting. And he writes to Malty and he says, are these ladies of the Congressional Union variety? And what stands out to me about that is he's been president now for 3 years, and Wilson has no idea who is who. He doesn't know their names. He doesn't know who is Carrie Chapman Catt. He doesn't know who is Alice Paul. So his secretary turns to Gardner's memo and says, oh no, Carrie Chapman Catt's not one of the protesters. She's president of Nassau. So he says, okay, great, Tuesday at 2 p.m. So from there on out, Gardner is in the White House basically every day, either on the phone, in person, or by letter between 1916 and ratification. She becomes a really close ally of Wilson. She converts him into a suffrage advocate, believe it or not, and uses this to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. So from this powerful vantage point, she exercises a lot of influence in the shaping of the rhetoric and the letter writing campaigns that get the 19th Amendment through Congress. And this is where racism is the most prominent message. If you were a fly on the wall in the 19 teens when Congress is finally debating the 19th Amendment, you would have been very confused about what amendment they're talking about. The main amendment that congressmen of both parties in all regions say by name is the 15th, the amendment that enfranchised Black men and said the federal government had the power to enforce. So by the 19 teens, no members of Congress are saying women can't vote because they're too emotional. They're not saying women can't vote because it'll destroy marriage. No one is really saying that. What they are saying is we can't enfranchise Black women in the South. And they're saying we hate the 15th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment is basically doubling down on the 15th. They're concerned that for two reasons. They're concerned that having a second voting rights amendment will somehow compel the federal government to enforce the 15th, which it has not done since the Compromise of 1877, so that not only will Black women vote, so too will Black men who have been disenfranchised because of various state-based poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm going to drink something. Thank you. And I saw these arguments time and time again in the letters that Gardner is writing and in the speeches that congressmen gave. So when the House passed the 19th Amendment in 1918, the women suffragists knew that they were going to need to convert a couple senators. They thought that the 19th Amendment would get through the Senate pretty quickly in 1918. They were totally wrong, but that's what they thought. And they thought they would just have to shift a few Southern senators. So Gardner starts with John Sharp Williams. They are friends. She has hosted his daughter at her house. They have dinner together. They celebrate the wife's birthday together. And John Sharp Williams, unlike the other senator from Mississippi, reads books. He even wrote books. He has a library. So they think they're going to have a good chance with the most erudite man in the Senate. So the day after the House passes the 19th Amendment, Gardner writes her friend John Sharp Williams. And she says, did you notice that in the House, the entire Mississippi delegation voted against the 19th Amendment? I want you to redeem that state. And she really lays it on thick. This letter is 3 pages long. She goes on and on about his grandchildren, his legacy, what a great guy he is. Doesn't he want to be on the right side of history? Doesn't he want to enfranchise his daughters, his wife, his friend, Helen Hamilton Gardner? He writes back the very next day and he says, my dear friend, if anything in the world could get me to do the thing you want, it would be your letter. However, he says, I will never vote to enfranchise the Black women of Mississippi. First of all, he writes, as you can see here, they will go to the polls, whereas most white women will stay home, he says. And second of all, he says that most Black men in Mississippi don't go to the polls because of all the various laws Mississippi has passed to disenfranchise them. He says the real reason Black men don't vote is because they know if they do, they will be hurt. So here he's saying we use violence to disenfranchise Black men, and we could not do that against women. He says in the next page, they are, after all, women, and if we beat up Black women, that the whole like public opinion of the world would be too against us. So this is how he's explaining his no vote. And I point this out not because this is the only place I saw this argument, but because this is the argument I saw everywhere in so many places from leaders of both parties. Also, the Lion of Idaho, William Borah, a Republican, makes similar arguments, even though he favored kind of suffrage. So from both parties and all states, or all parts of the country, I should say, this is the main objection to the 19th Amendment, is concerns about Black women voting in the South and concerns about actually having to uphold and enforce the 15th Amendment. So how the 19th Amendment actually finally passes Congress is that white suffragists like Gardner make a devil's bargain. And they say to leaders of Congress, to President Wilson, we don't care about Black women voting in the South. Carrie Chapman Catt expressly says, you guys can just disenfranchise Black women voters the exact same way you've disenfranchised Black men. Poll taxes, literacy tests. We won't say a peep about enforcement. Just give us the 19th Amendment. And that is how the 19th Amendment is signed into law. And we live with that legacy today. That is why the 19th Amendment didn't become a reality for women of color, or most women of color, until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that is which has been subsequently dismantled, which is another reason why I'm so passionate about the League of Women Voters. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, but this to me really stands out as one of the key legacies of the 19th Amendment, is the role that race and racism played in its trajectory and in the lack of enforcement later on. Now, this slide here brings me to my third and final point. memory. Whose stories do we remember? Whose stories do we tell? How and why? Gardner is here. This is a picture of the signing ceremony for the 19th Amendment. Why is Gardner here? She is the shorter woman to the left of the Speaker of the House as he signs the amendment before it goes to the states. She is here at this ceremony because she planned it. This is the first signing ceremony. There had been previous signing ceremonies for treaties, but not for legislation or amendments. Gardner plans this because she's a PR whiz, and she wants there to be cameras. There's even motion picture cameras at this event because of Gardner. She plans it also because she wants to stick it to Alice Paul. You'll notice Alice Paul is not at the signing ceremony. Gardner wants the historical record to reflect the 19th Amendment as a Nassau victory, not a Alice Paul protesters victory. Um, so that's who's at the signing ceremony, Nassau. And also Gardner plans this ceremony because she really wants there to be a historical record about it. Not only does she orchestrate the ceremony and all the press coverage, she also orders a fancy gold pen that she has inscribed saying this was the pen used to sign the 19th Amendment. And then the very next day, she writes her friends at the Smithsonian and she says, "Hey, Smithsonian, I am in possession of all these historic artifacts about the suffrage movement. I've got Susan B. Anthony's red shawl. I've got the desk where Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the 19th Amendment. I got the pen." She says, "I want you to take these artifacts and I want you to put together a really marquee exhibit at the Smithsonian, the nation's museum, telling the story of women's contributions to American life." She transfers all the materials. The Smithsonian's like, "Okay, fine, sure." But the exhibit they put together, as you may know, was not remotely what Gardner had in mind. It was titled An Important Epic. And they put this little teeny tiny exhibit together on the landing space on a flight of stairs. You know, you walk up one flight of stairs, you shift directions, and then you go up the next flight. So on that little landing space is where this exhibit was. And for the next 75-ish years, that was basically the main national remembrance of the suffrage movement. So Gardner's final years were spent trying to shore up historical memory and shift the way our nation talks about its history. Not only does she create this or try to create this exhibit, she also gives a lot of speeches about it. Her very last public speech, given just a couple months before she died, was on this very topic. President Wilson, because she had befriended him and because he liked her the best of all the suffragists, promoted or nominated Gardner to the U.S. Civil Service Commission in 1920. He knew that he wanted to make a public statement, do something to mark the new status of women in America. So he picked Gardner for this high profile appointment, which made her the highest ranking and most powerful woman in federal government. Civil Service Commission is just one level below cabinet. And so she got tons of national press coverage for having this really prominent role. This is her being sworn in, and she loved this job. It was the first time since she was a school teacher in Sandusky that she had like a regular paycheck. And one of the things she worked for was to remove prohibitions against married women working. But her passion project during this time was shoring up the memory of suffrage. So her final speech that she gave at the Nassau Looking Backwards lunch in 1925 was about this very topic. And she wrote, or she said in this speech, you know, she said, "We can almost see Arlington National Cemetery from this beautiful hotel where they're gathered for the lunch." And she said, "You know, everyone goes to Arlington to see our nation's heroes. We can see them also in the beautiful statuary around DC and in the many monuments that were erected during their lifetime." And she says, "But where are our heroes buried? And who was remembering them?" And she pointed to many women whose names had already been forgotten, even by their fellow suffragists. And she names the first generation of leaders and the second generation of leaders. And she urges the women at this lunch to keep their memories green. And she says, women's rights heroes are buried in unmarked or unnamed, remarkable graves in little visited cemeteries across the country, which is true to this day. And I wanted to end on this picture because I love it so much. It's Gardner. She had two horses, two Andalusian white horses that she loved to ride around DC. This is before she got access to a car as civil service commissioner, which she loved even more. But when she had her horses, she would create quite a sensation riding about in these beautiful horses. And she posed for this picture in the early 1900s. And I think this is Thomas Square in DC. So she watched all these Civil War heroes get their statues. And I think what she's saying here is, where's my statue? When are we going to get to travel around and remark on all the women who have contributed to our country and take a moment to reflect at their statues? So I will end there and I will say thank you so much for having me. I am really glad to be here and I welcome your questions.
Fantastic.
And I'm sorry about my voice.
Oh, uh, believe me, we'll all be sounding like that soon, probably. It snowed here yesterday, but I'm sure sometime this weekend
The
I'll
green
be.
dust is coming for you.
Exactly, exactly. That was amazing. And I will just remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A section. So while you're processing and thinking of your questions, I am just going to do a couple of housekeeping announcements. I want to mention that our current exhibit will be closing in 2 weeks. So if you'd like to see it in person, you need to come very soon. It's More Than Gray, Reimagining Early America in Full Color. And it illuminates the brighter side of history, spotlighting all the color and vibrancy that are often concealed in the gray and sepia tones of pre-1900 American imagery. And it's funny because as you were showing what are really beautiful photographs, I was wondering what colors she was wearing because of this exhibit. uh, I'm, you don't know. Was she bright and colorful? Probably. And I also want to mention that there is still time to register for our April 2nd event, A Conflict of Emotions, Thomas and Margaret Gage and the American Revolution. So we'd love to see people at that event as well. And this is the first year that we have awarded 2 Mary G. Stang Fellowships for Creative and Performing Artists and Writers. And as part of his residency, Alex Ames will play at that April 2nd event and then also host a pop-up exhibit at the Clements March 31st through April 4th from noon to 4 p.m. So you can see some of the materials that he used as he was putting together the pieces that he plays, and you can hear him play during some of that time as well. So I hope people will check that out. It's something very new for the Clements Library and kind of exciting. And then next month on the Bookworm, we welcome our very own curator of manuscripts, Cheney Choperet, to the Bookworm to discuss the exhibit Bloody Work, Lexington and Concord, 1775, which will also open on that same day, Friday, April 18th. So I hope that you'll join us again. Or the other thing that happens, and you'll receive this later today, we do send out an email with the recording as well as all of the resources mentioned in today's Bookworm. And so you can choose each month whether to attend live or to watch the recording. And again, thank you, Cinda Sue Davis, for sponsoring today's episode. If you're interested in sponsoring future bookworms or have any other comments, questions, ideas, please feel free to reach out to me. You can always just respond to the email that you receive from me, and I'm happy to have those conversations. All right, I will stop the share and we can see what kinds of questions we have. Bruce, I noticed that Bruce actually put this question in before you started to talk
Oh,
about some of the racism issues related to suffrage, but he was wondering if the age of consent
oh, yes,
also
yes.
was an artifact of slavery.
Bruce, 1000%. Well, age of consent is from British common law. So the barristers of the UK decided 10 or 12 was the age based on when they thought girls menstruated. But the race part comes into play when the women activists in the US try to change the age, try to change the laws. So one thing I think is super fascinating about age of consent, I wrote an essay about this called What the Age of Consent Taught Suffragists About the Vote, or something like that. We could put a link in the chat. But in a nutshell, um, this it's like a one-to-one. The states that refuse to raise the age of consent are the same states that don't ratify. So it's a real, it's this same argument. So the southern states do not raise the age of consent mostly at all. And if they do raise the age of consent, they write in, this only applies to white girls, or this only applies to girls who can prove they are virgins, which is obviously nonsense. And it's just a way for them to say that women of color weren't virgins. And because the white male leaders of the South wanted to continue raping Black women and girls with impunity as they had been doing all along. So yes, it's also very much about race, and it's a real foreshadowing of how the suffrage debates are going to go.
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks, Bruce, for that good question. And I will just give a shout out to Bruce because Bruce is watching live from California. So he got up very, early to participate and to think of good questions.
Thank you, Bruce.
Um, Elizabeth is wondering whether or not the people of Sandusky ever figured out that HHG was really Alice Chenoweth.
Yes. Well, I've given a lot of talks in Sandusky. So at least all the people of Sandusky who went to my talks or who I met when I was doing research at the Sandusky Library. One like super teeny fun fact, at the so the issue of the Sandusky Daily Register that printed her name and that was then later reprinted all over the state, someone went in, HHG, someone later, I don't know, but cut it out. So like even if you're looking at the microfilm, which obviously is what I had to do, it's not there. There's no actual little blurb that says her name. The headline is there. I know it's there and I know what it says because other papers printed it up. But some woman, and I think probably HHG, because I can imagine that's what I would do. Like, oh my God, make this stop. I can't, I need to get my name out of the paper, cut it out. So if you go to Sandusky and you look at the microfilm, you're not going to find it there because it's been cut out. But yes, the people of Sandusky do now know. And then another super weird thing. So another question is, how did HHG meet the guy, Selden Allen Day, who became her husband? So at the Sandusky Library, there's a picture of Selden Day, like a calling card picture that he signed and that he gave to his friends in Sandusky. So did somehow she meet him through there? And then when she got married to Selden Allen Day in 1902, I think, um, she invited some of her friends from Sandusky and they put it in the paper, like in the social column, but they called her Helen Hamilton Gardner. And they didn't say, they said she used to live here, but they didn't say when she lived here, her name was Alice Chenoweth and we ran her out of town. So I don't know.
So, but the first wife continued to live in Sandusky.
First wife, oh no, sorry. So the Charles Smart is not from Sandusky. He was the statewide commissioner of schools. So that's why Sandusky was like, why is this guy constantly in our town? He doesn't live here. His job is to monitor the public schools of all of Ohio, but yet he's constantly in Sandusky. He lived in Columbus or a neighboring town with his wife and two daughters. And then the one daughter gets sick and they move to Florida and they end up in West Virginia. So he didn't so from after the scandal with Gardner, he doesn't ever live in the house with his wife and daughters again. But unbeknownst to Gardner, he's visiting them. So like when she is in Chicago giving more talks than any other American woman at the World's Fair, he hightails it to West Virginia and sneaks off with Gardner's money, P.S., footing the bill, to visit the wife and daughters.
Huh.
So that's one of the things that she says in those letters to Mary Phillips is like, now looking back, like I see he's been visiting them all along whenever I leave him unchaperoned. And so uh, and then you might also ask, like, why does she stay with him? Also, I think he has syphilis. I think that's what
So,
he dies from. He's in a sanitarium because also everyone has syphilis in the
mhm.
19th century. So he dies in a sanitarium where he insists on being in like the fanciest room that Gardner has to pay for, um, while he's losing his marbles from tertiary syphilis. Yeah.
Wow, so you're
So
not
why is she
kidding
with him?
about how juicy that letter is.
Yeah.
That is one juicy letter. Oh my gosh. All right. So, uh, Carlos is wondering, after being ignored, what did the Black suffragette
Oh,
organizations do to help get the 19th Amendment passed?
so the black women did so much to get the 19th Amendment passed. I think you're also saying how did they try to get it enforced, right? Um, so another thing about suffrage history is for the most part, Black women were excluded from groups with the word suffrage in the title because those were white-led groups who may or may not have been, if they weren't actually segregated, they were like de facto segregated. So there were some members, suffrage groups would invite Mary Church Terrell, the president of the National Association of Colored Women, to speak, and they would invite Ida B. Wells sometimes, but they weren't accepted on equal footing. So Black women advocated for suffrage through civil rights organizations, through their churches, through Black women's clubs. So they did, the amazing amounts of work to get suffrage passed and ratified. And what they did after ratification, and especially what Mary Church Terrell did, and this is the most evidence in the historical record, is she went back to her friends-ish colleagues in Nassau, which by now is the League of Women Voters, and Alice Paul's National Women's Party. And she writes them, Mary Church Terrell writes, Maud Wood Park, president of the League, writes Alice Paul, and she says, hey, it was so great how we worked together to get the 19th Amendment ratified. I don't know if you all know this, but Black women in the South are being turned away at the polls. They still can't vote. Can you, white ladies, with your privilege, help us get the 19th Amendment enforced? It's not a reality for our Black sisters. We need you to help get it enforced. And so the white leaders at League of Women Voters, and National Women's Party say no. They either ignore her, or Alice Paul says, that's really your problem. That's a race issue, she says, not a sex issue. And the book that you might want to check out on this is by a legal historian at Johns Hopkins, Paul Monopoly, called Constitutional Orphan. And so what she's looking at is 1920s, maybe into the 1930s, cases where the 19th Amendment was, where people were trying to ferret out, like, what does this mean? How can it be implied? Where is it enforced? And compared to other amendments, it's not talked about that much. Like, it is not enforced. And it's not enforced because the white suffrage leaders don't want to enforce it. And the Black women are demanding that it be enforced.
Yeah, it's, all of these things, it's never a straightforward
Mhm.
path. So thank you. Thank you for that. And Paul is wondering how visiting all the actual places that HHG lived changed the trajectory of the book.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you, Paul. Um, so it changed the trajectory in some ways from, I think, well, I don't know if it changed the trajectory or it changed, can I say the word my 14-year-old says? It changed the vibe, Paul. I feel like I really understood her. Like I would, like I under, without having gone places, I don't think I would have understood what it meant to be a Chenoweth of Virginia and what it meant for her to grow up as a Chenoweth of Virginia. Like she was a little bit like, the cousin on Succession who's like rich adjacent. She was like that. Like she knew that she was from the rich family, but not rich. So she had that cousin Greg. She had that like I'm a Chenoweth thing, which gave her confidence. and access, but not money. So I understood that. Um, and then I also like seeing the DC house was huge too. Like, oh, like she lives next door to the speaker. Like that. See, if I hadn't have seen the porches, I wouldn't have understood precisely how she worked her diplomacy. So I really liked that. And then in terms of the Greencastle, Indiana trip, like when I climbed that ladder to get down the probate materials from the 1870s, that again, I don't know if it changed their trajectory, but I understood like how much her family had had and how much the family had lost because of the Civil War. So her brothers and dad fight for the Union. They don't die in battle, but they die early as a result of their war injuries. And so I understood that a little more. And also I understood like her financial situation and like what a hustler she was and how much it meant to her then to be the civil service commissioner and get a paycheck. Like she loved having a paycheck. She bought Maudwood Park silk scarves. She sent her favorite niece to college. Like she was so excited to have a paycheck because she had, as you can imagine, as I can imagine, right, having hustled for so long to make ends meet.
Um, Ava sort of has a little addendum to that. Why and maybe even when did you decide that you would do that geographical research?
Oh, that's a good question. So I in 2017, I applied for and then received a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, which enabled me to have a year plus off from teaching. And so when I got this amazing, wonderful gift of news, then I thought, what would I like, where do I want to go? And I think I had never written a biography before. I didn't really think like I'm a biographer. I was much more comfortable like with text-based documents, going to the archives and looking at words. So I thought a way to get away from that and I knew to write a biography, I had to write like more about who is she as a person, what what did her life look like to her, that I wanted to see the places. So having this fellowship enabled me to do it, and why I wanted to do it was I knew I needed I needed to access another layer of information than what I could find in text-based documents in the archives.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. Um, and I mean, even the materials in the archives, one of the things that the students often say is they're like, what? So and so touched this, and you have this moment of, you
Yep.
know, HHG wrote this, which is that sort of visceral sense of history, which is so amazing. Which is why even with uh, digitization, which helps to make helps people's research,
Yep.
there's still something about going and seeing those documents in person that makes a huge difference.
1,000%.
Um, so Tim, and I don't know if you want to send this to him directly. I'm not sure if you want to how you want to do this, but he's in Toledo and has spent plenty of time in Sandusky and really wants to drive by the boarding house.
Oh, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. I think I have the address in my book. Don't have it memorized, but I could,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I love that.
And the people who live
Um,
there are super nice. Yeah, as you saw, they let me in. We took all the pictures. They were excited, and it has it because it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It still looks, similar to how it would have when HHG boarded there.
that's really cool. Do they have are they so lucky as to have like a little sign out front or
Not about her. There's no HHG sign, but they have a National Register of Historic Places sign.
lovely?
Yep.
Um, so let's see. So Pamela is thinking a little bit about the strategic split between
Uh,
playing, publicly through demonstrations and then also this behind the scenes piece, and thinking both are vital and just wondering, sort of as a thread um, in these various feminist um, trajectories, if you're sort of seeing any threads between how those two
Mhm.
interact or importance or
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, HHG wanted to claim Nassau got the vote. Our way was right. We did it. The suffragette or the protesters did nothing but like derail us and cause us problems, which is 1,000% what she felt like. Every time she thought she had the suffrage committee created in the House, which was like a procedural thing you had to do to move your bill around, Alice Paul would protest and somebody would pull their vote. So she was like, oh my God, ladies, like sit down and let me do my job. But Alice Paul thought she got the amendment. She thought if we just sat around and wrote letters, we'd still be sitting around writing letters. So I think they're both right. The only reason that Woodrow Wilson agreed to meet with Chapman Catt, and the only reason HHG made it into the White House is because Wilson hated Alice Paul's guts. He knew he had to talk with some suffragist. Alice Paul made that point for him that he needed to deal with this, but he surely was not going to deal with Alice Paul. So if it weren't for Alice Paul, HHG would not be getting her 22 favors from Wilson. So I think it's really a both and. Um, but if you're also asking like today, I mean, one thing that, so, I mean, today it's different, right? Like Gardner and the Nassau women were effective because when they called their elected representatives, someone answered the phone. When they wrote letters to their elected representatives, someone wrote back. Like, even if it wasn't Gardner's friend, you could expect a level of responsiveness. Now, as a result of gerrymandering, campaign finance, a whole host of things that the League of Women Voters and other groups is working to electoral college, we don't have that. Like, have you tried to call or email your representative recently?
yeah.
It doesn't work the same. So I don't know so if you're asking like what is the takeaway message for 2025, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure it's still some level of both and, but it looks different. And I think what we also need to be fighting for are these like basic structural reforms like congressional accountability and actual representation and districts that look like they're districts and votes that are enabled to be cast and then counted.
Thank you. Cheryl, I think, is interested a little bit more about that personal rift between Paul and Gardner. You mentioned they were besties and then they weren't. So is there evidence as to when it all went wrong?
Yeah. It went wrong pretty quickly after the parade. So at first, so Gardner, when Alice Paul gets permission from Nassau to do the parade, the first person she calls is Helen Hamilton Gardner because she knows she's going to need that address book. Um, so at first, and Gardner's like, oh, here's like a fun new young friend. So at first they're frenemies all day. Alice Paul's writing like, the only person here with me sun up to past sundown is Helen Hamilton Gardner. But right after the parade, Alice Paul's like, okay, awesome. Now we're going to start protesting. And Gardner's like, what? No, no, we are not. So it's pretty immediate. So by 1914 is when Alice Paul is thinking of leaving. Because right after the parade, the first thing they want to do is get the House to create a woman's suffrage committee. And that's the procedural thing they need to move the 19th Amendment out of the Rules Committee. So Gardner's trying to get this, and she thinks like she has the votes. And then Alice Paul starts protesting, and she's losing her votes. And so she's also so mad. And then Nassau is trying to keep Alice Paul in check. They love that she's so smart and energetic and that she's young. They want her, but they're scared of her. And so it comes to a head over the composition of the Nassau Congressional Committee. So Alice Paul plans the parade under the auspices of the Nassau Congressional Committee, which is what HHG is on. Nassau is headquartered at this time in New York. The Congressional Committee is their DC operation. So Alice Paul basically says, I'm not going to be on the Congressional Committee if Helen Hamilton Gardner is. And so then they tell her, well, we won't invite her back. But then someone somewhere leaks the membership list, like who they're going to put on the committee, and Helen Hamilton Gardner's name is on it. So then Alice Paul's like, I'm out. I'm starting my own group. First it's called the Congressional Union, then it's called National Women's Party. So when I say like their rift played or their feud played a big role in the rift, like it really did.
Wow. Yeah. So yeah, that's really interesting to think about all of that going back and forth
And
during
Alice
that
Paul,
time.
one more thing I'll say on that is if you want to hear more about it, you can listen to Alice Paul's oral history that she recorded towards the end of her, like 50 years later. I think it's at Berkeley. If you Google it, you will find it. And she's so mad. 50, 70 years later, she's talking about the Penn ceremony. I can't believe Helen Hamilton Gardner got to go to the Penn ceremony and I didn't. Why was she there? So she didn't, Alice Paul didn't know that Gardner was there because she planned it, but she's just mad that Alice Paul wasn't there. So it burns, red hot, white hot for
Wow,
decades.
gosh, that's amazing. Thank you. Well, this has been amazing. And so thank you so much. And thank you for writing the book. Thank you for, I mean, I think bringing these stories to the forefront is amazing. And, as an archive, we always love to hear that process. So thank you so much for interweaving, the themes and the process together. That was amazing.
Well, it was so fun for me, in case you couldn't tell. And thank you. I love the Clements. I love everything you do. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you, everybody who joined us, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.